Hello, my name is Paul Murray. I'm a solutions architect at Nutanix, and in today's webinar I'd like to talk to you about end user computing and some of the terminology, some of the components that you need to understand to be able to confidently talk to your customers around these technologies. Today we'll be covering what EUC is, some of those definitions, so things such as VDI, desktop as a service, virtual applications, and then we'll look at the options that we have as a Nutanix to be able to help solve those challenges that your customers have. So the way I like to talk about this is to explain what EUC is and how we actually got there, or how we actually got to where we are today. So if you look back in history, if you look back to the sort of 60s and 70s, computing was essentially a set of computers, so hosts or mainframes installed in a data center that very few people had access to. The people that had access to those machines were scientists, were engineers. Someone then came up with the idea of connecting a terminal to these mainframes, and that's essentially when end user computing or remote desktops or remote computing started. So the ability to be able to use a terminal not in that data center and still be able to use the computing resources. Marketing came along and essentially called it end user computing. Now, first of all, end user computing has a lot of different descriptions in the industry. One thing that I always like to get across is that end user computing is not VDI. So end user computing is not a virtual desktop infrastructure. In the same sense, in the same fashion, VDI is also not desktop as a service. So these are three common terms that you're going to be confronted with when you're talking to customers: EUC, VDI, and desktop as a service. But like I said, EUC is not VDI, and VDI is certainly not desktop as a service. So when I say that, what do I actually mean? So end user computing is essentially, it's a superset of technologies that is required to manage the environment for your employees to be able to access resources, to be able to perform their tasks. So end user computing consists of a lot of different technologies: profile management, printer management, operating system management, mobile device management. Within that group, under that umbrella, are also two pieces: virtual desktop infrastructure and desktop as a service. So let's take a few moments and look at those two components. If we look at what or how the industry describes end user computing, it's essentially the ability or the empowerment for today's workforce with secure access to the desktops, applications, and data from any device over any connection. If we look at how this originated historically, so to go back to the late 90s, mid 90s, then there was a company around there called Citrix. They developed a technology called server-based computing. So server-based computing was essentially the first steps to what we now call virtual desktop infrastructure. The first concept that Citrix had was remote access. That's what Citrix were famous for many, many years ago, was the ability for employees to be able to remotely access a desktop. Now, these desktops are running on a centralized server in a data center. So essentially, they took a single user operating system, so Windows is a single user OS, and made that multi-user. A few years later, Citrix then came up with the concept of publishing applications. So again, same sort of concept, everything installed on servers in a data center. But what Citrix did towards the end of the 90s was a thing called published applications. So they had two possibilities. As an employee, you could connect to a virtual desktop. In those days, we didn't know what the word virtual desktop meant. It didn't exist, but you connected to your remote desktop. As an employee, you also had the ability or the option to use individual applications that were published to you based on your access, based on your role. A few years later, VMware came around and coined the term virtual desktop infrastructure. So as the name sort of implies, what VDI is nothing other than virtualizing that complete desktop, putting that in the data center, and giving the users, giving the employees access to that desktop. A few years later, further down the path, a couple of years ago, the industry came up with a thing called desktop as a service. So essentially, very similar to VDI, your desktops are then virtualized, But in this instance, the data center is in the cloud. The data center is something or the desktops are something you access as a cloud service, a desktop as a service. There's two other pieces in there that I'll always talk about are terminal services. So terminal services are the underlying technology that enables server-based computing, virtual desktop infrastructure, to a certain extent desktop as a service. Terminal services itself today belongs to Microsoft, but is a technology originally developed by Citrix and then licensed to Microsoft. Microsoft have since renamed that technology, so it's now Remote Desktop Session Host. But essentially, server-based computing, VDI, and desktop as a service is what your customers are going to be talking about. So Citrix and VMware are going to show you this story. So if you talk to VMware, if you talk to Citrix in the sense of VDI or server-based computing, they're going to describe it as something like delivering applications and desktops automatically in real time. Citrix will talk about connecting people to applications and desktops. Essentially the same technology, essentially the same concept. What you have at the top of the screen, or the top of the slide, is a set of clients. So any client can be used. If you look at today's technology, most companies will talk about a device with an HTML5 web browser on it. So any sort of client can be used to connect to those remote desktops. So if it's the same, what are then the differences between these different concepts? So if we look at closer, go back to this statement about end user computing. Enabling or empowering today's workforce. The differences really are in what we are empowering that workforce with. So first of all, secure access, but it can be to desktops, so virtual desktop infrastructure. It could be applications, a virtual application infrastructure. And in both cases, we need data. A desktop or an application without data is worthless. It's just a web browser, but again, from any device over any connection. So server-based computing allows desktop application and application access. A virtual desktop infrastructure that allows a desktop centric type of computing. Desktop as a service, also a desktop centric type of computing. So typically what you'll see at customers is a combination of all three of these. I don't know of many customers that have only server-based computing or only a VDI or virtual desktop infrastructure. So like I said, typically you're going to see a combination of these technologies. So why do customers do that? Why specifically virtual applications? Why specifically virtual desktops? Or why a combination of both? Again, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about virtual apps or virtual desktops. The pain points that these technologies can solve or can cure are centralized management. So typically, without a VDI or without a virtual application infrastructure, it's difficult to manage those applications. It's difficult to perform upgrades to the operating systems, to the applications. Security is also an important piece of the equation. So I need a secure method of accessing that application, accessing that data. Again, security is built into these technologies. And then other customers, they want to go the route of bring your own desktop or BYOD or CYOD. So choose your own desktop, choose your own device. So again, virtual desktop infrastructure, virtual application infrastructure enables a company to be able to deploy a bring your own desktop, bring your own device type concept. We look at the companies involved. The main players involved in the VDI marketplace or the virtual application marketplace are Citrix, VMware, and Microsoft. So I mentioned these before. Citrix has been around for over 30 years now. So virtual applications and virtual desktops. VMware, they have a product called Horizon View. So they've been on the market since around 2007. And then Microsoft is often overlooked, but remote desktop services, their VDI technologies, is also something that customers use. So they've had that product since about 1996 when they, like I said, they licensed that from Citrix. What's important here is these companies, so Citrix, VMware, and Microsoft, when we're talking about on-prem VDI, these are not competitors to Nutanix. These are partners for Nutanix. So Citrix, VMware, and Microsoft, they are partners for VMware, for Nutanix, when it comes to on-prem virtual desktop infrastructure. We then look at desktop as a service, companies there, so Amazon with their workspaces, Citrix managed desktops, Microsoft virtual desktop, VMware Horizon Cloud, and then Zyframe. So Zyframe is our technology, that's a Nutanix product, but what's important here is when we're talking about desktop as a service, Citrix, Microsoft, VMware, they suddenly become competitors for Nutanix. So again, it's important to understand what technology your customer is looking to deploy when it comes to understanding, is that a competitive situation or is that a partnership situation? So again, desktop as a service, Citrix, Microsoft, VMware, they're typically competitors for Nutanix in that environment. So let's look at the solutions for EUC. So again, I segmented it or separated it between traditional VDI and desktop as a service. So traditional VDI, the most important thing here is that the user experience, the employee experience has to be good. So if the users experience a poor, or if the users experience a poor performance, then that VDI solution is destined to fail. So performance has to be extremely good for a VDI solution to be successful. If we look at the typical building blocks in an EUC solution, we're talking about up to 9 separate components or 9 separate vendors. So from the top of the stack to the bottom, we're talking about delivery protocol to be able to get that application out to your employees, secure remote access, ensuring that it's secure, the actual desktop or application delivery, user profile management, virtualization, technologies, server, networking, data protection, storage, and stuff like that. So there's a lot of pieces, there's a lot of building blocks required to be able to deploy or build a successful EUC solution. That leads into complexity. That leads into difficulties to scale that solution. That could also lead into an inconsistent performance, which often results in that solution not being employee focused. So these are typical problems that a customer has to overcome to ensure that that VDI solution is successful. Now, if you look at what two companies do, so the two companies I talk about here are Nutanix and Citrix. It could also be Nutanix and VMware, but I'll stay with Nutanix and Citrix. But what I'm talking about here is, if you look at what Nutanix does, the virtualization, the server piece, the storage technologies, data protection, the networking security, that's something that we've been doing for many, many years. That's our HCI solution, hyperconverged infrastructure. If you look at what Citrix brings to the equation, so they do the delivery protocol, they do the security pieces, they ensure that the applications and desktops can be pushed out to those end users, the employees. They also have components that do profile management. So essentially what we've done is we've taken what was previously 9 or possibly up to 9 separate vendors and have reduced that down to basically 2 vendors. Nutanix and Citrix are market leaders in both of their technologies. So Nutanix is the market leader in HCI. Citrix is one of the market leaders when it comes to end user computing. These solutions are co-developed. We've worked with Citrix for many years to ensure that our technologies and their technologies work together. That enables things such as pay-as-you-grow. Part of our architecture is extremely important. You do not need to be able to size that solution for what might happen in 2 years' time. You can start today to deploy a solution for 300 users. As requirements increase over time, you can add in additional components, add in additional hardware to be able to scale that solution linearly. So it really does become true hybrid cloud, and it really is possible. It really is simple enough to be able to deploy in hours and not weeks compared to a traditional 3-tier architecture. One thing I always talk about is linear scalability. So what I'm trying to get across here is, as I just mentioned, we can start small. So start with a small cluster that has enough capacity to be able to support 500 users. As requirements increase over time, there becomes a point where you need to add in additional hardware, add in additional resources. Now, it's extremely important that as you add in those resources, that it scales linearly. We don't need to be changing the architecture. We don't want to change the architecture or the design just because I have a requirement to add in 500 more additional users. So this linear scalability is an extremely important concept when it comes to Nutanix, HCI, and Citrix EUC running on top. In terms of employee performance, just to sort of highlight those numbers. So on this chart, what we see is we're starting with 300 users, and the response time of those applications, so Word, Outlook, Excel, PDF, is sort of between 0.6 and 1.4 seconds, depending on that application. So that's the relative application performance. But like I said, extremely critical to a successful VDI solution, the VDI project, is as I need to add in additional users, that scalability or that application performance remains consistent for my employees. So in this case, going from 300, 600, all the way to 3,000 users or 3,000 desktops, the response time for the application basically stays the same. So we can guarantee a linear scalability as we add in additional resources for to match the requirements. If we look at the solutions, so the base solution, Nutanix Core, that's our traditional HCI solution. So this is what Nutanix is famous for, is the hyperconverged infrastructure. So that's going to eliminate your operational complexity. It's going to reduce sizing issues. Like I said, we can start today with a small cluster and expand that out as is needed based on requirements of the end users. We look at the middle column, that's what we call Nutanix Essentials. So those are additional technologies that are extremely important in a VDI solution. So Nutanix files, mentioned it at the start of the presentation. We talk about virtual applications, virtual desktops. They're pointless without data. So Nutanix files is an offering that we got that allows us to be able to essentially spin up file servers or Windows servers for your departmental shares, for your user profiles, and that storage is consumed from the Nutanix cluster. When we're talking about a VDI infrastructure, networking or network segmentation is often a requirement from customers. So our product there is Nutanix Flow. That is going to allow us to do network segmentation, so the east-west traffic on your virtual machines. Important here, it's applied or adheres to the one-click strategy that we got. So we don't need to define IP tails and stuff like that. Essentially, we select the virtual machines that can communicate with each other. We say through which TCP ports they can communicate. We deploy that, and then that microsegmentation is essentially deployed for that environment. Go a step further with automation. So Calm is an automation technology. It's a DevOps technology. So with Calm, we can automate the deployment of these hundreds or thousands of desktops. And then the third column, Nutanix Enterprise. Again, as the solution grows, you're going to start looking at things such as disaster recovery. So Xi Leap or Xi Cloud Services is going to allow you to extend the inbuilt disaster recovery from the Nutanix cluster. So essentially three main components: Nutanix Core, Nutanix Essentials, and then Nutanix Enterprise. So as a summary for the on-premise pieces, again, what we do is sort of break it down into two main pieces. So the infrastructure piece, that's what we do, that's what Nutanix does. And then the VDI piece or the EUC piece, that's what Citrix, or that's what VMware does. And again, extremely important, I keep saying it, is the ability to be able to scale out as your requirements change. So add in additional hardware, those desktops are there. Add in another layer of hardware, and those desktops again are there. So scaling from 300 to 3,000. I know of deployments that are scaling to tens of thousands, so 20, 30, 40,000 desktops in a single environment. So let's talk about Frame, our desktop as a service offering. So Frame is essentially, it's a secure cloud platform that allows you as a customer to be able to deliver Windows and Linux applications or desktops to your employees through a simple device using a web browser. One of the big differences between Frame and other desktop as a service solutions is the ability for Frame to be able to provide workloads from multiple cloud providers. So we have support for AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud Platform. We also support Frame running on AHV on-prem. So by combining these four workloads, or these four cloud platforms as such, allows us to be able to say it really is a true multi-cloud hybrid cloud solution. You can have applications running on AWS as the same customer. You can have your different applications for different departments running on Azure, Google Cloud, or AHV, or whatever. The way it works is very simple. So it's always about customer choice. There's a few steps that we need to go through to be able to provide a Frame solution. So first of all, we need to be able to pick the infrastructure. So your compute platform, whether it has graphic requirements, the networking requirements, the memory setup, stuff like that. The second part is then to select the authorization subsystems. So Frame has its own internal authentication subsystem, but ideally you would want to link that into AD or ADFS or Okta or any type of SAML authentication subsystem. Then the next two steps would be to bring your own applications. So your Adobe applications, your AutoCAD apps, your Office suite, they need to be installed in those desktops. Again, I've said it a few times, a desktop without data is pretty useless. So then we need to be able to connect to your storage provider of choice. Again, free choice here. So it could be OneDrive, Box, Dropbox, or whatever. If we're using Frame on-prem, then the obvious solution there would be to have Nutanix files. And then the last part is then to essentially deliver those applications to your employees. That delivery is nothing other than sending out an email with a URL for that user to be able to connect to, with a username and password, be able to authenticate to the Xi desktop solution. So a few closing words. I've talked about EUC, VDI, server-based computing, desktop as a service, a lot of three-letter abbreviations in there. So this is essentially a summary of all of those different technologies, the products involved in there, whether it's on-prem, whether it's cloud-based, and like I said, basically a description of those definitions. We also talked about the evolution of EUC or VDI. So back in the 50s and 60s with the host systems, the data centers, when it's all managed. Then client-server computing came around with the unmanaged user devices, Windows, Intel, various different windowing systems. So X Windows, DOS, Windows version 1, OS 2, that sort of stuff. And then Citrix came along with multi-user, multi-win. Was what today is the Citrix virtual apps and desktops. So in sort of the early 90s, that was the start of what is now referred to as VDI. VMware came with their product or their offerings around 2007. So Virtual Desktop Manager, which today is Horizon View. Again, a lot of evolution in what EUC is. One thing I'll always talk about to customers is the fact that VDI is part of our DNA. It always was, always will be the best workload for Nutanix. That's how we pretty much started. So a lot of the first workloads that you would run on a Nutanix cluster were VDI solutions. That being said, I always say that Nutanix was and always will be the best platform for VDI. We talked about things such as linear scalability. We talked about a few of the technologies, but I certainly do believe that Nutanix always will be the best platform to run your VDI solutions on. So that was today's brief webinar about end user computing. I hope it was useful. In the next one, we'll be talking about business continuity, so using these technologies and how we can build those solutions. So for the time being, thanks very much for listening and speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.